Peter Knights is the CEO of WildAid, an NGO group that works to end the illegal wildlife trade. Elephant preservation is one of their key programs. So I asked him about the role of wildlife preserves and zoos in animal conservation.
Well, wildlife preserves and national parks are absolutely vital for conservation of endangered species. And there are also situations where a captive situation, like a zoo, may also be necessary. When the habitat is threatened, when the animals can't be protected, then captive breeding is really like a last resort for endangered species.
So what have we learned by the success of the giant panda, which is no longer on the endangered species list, especially when it comes to captive breeding programs?
Well, I think the success of the panda sort of resurrection, if you like, well, the real thing I take away from it is that conservation really takes political will. You really need to believe in what you're doing and be prepared to back it up. And there's no doubt the government of China for decades now has really supported panda conservation, even to the extent that, at one point it was actually death penalty if you poached a panda. I'm not in favor of the death penalty, but I can tell you this, there weren't many pandas poached. And the captive breeding side of things is essential in some cases where there is simply no way to secure the habitat. So, for example, we've just lost a species of bird in the Galapagos Islands because there are rats that have been introduced onto the island where this bird lives, and those rats are raiding the nests. And until you eradicate those rats, that species, can't survive without help from the outside.
So is there any downside to human intervention when it comes to conservation and the breeding process?
Well, obviously, the preferable way to do things is to preserve the animals in situ in the wild. It's way cheaper. It runs a lot less risk than taking them into captivity. There's always problems, potential problems, when you capture an animal. If you take them out of the wild, it's a very stressful process. They may die in that process. They may not adapt to a captive diet. Then it's also not easy putting animals back into the wild. For example, for tigers, we've been very successful in breeding tigers, but there's never been a successful reintroduction of tigers into the wild because the tiger's mother will teach them how to hunt, what to hunt, where to find food, and you can't do that necessarily in a zoo. And it's also sometimes difficult if animals have got used to human beings, they won't fear human beings anymore, and they'll come into contact in negative consequences after they're reintroduced. So it's not ideal, but there are some cases where it really is the only option left, and particularly for species like the oryx, for example, where the animal is a grazing animal, it doesn't have a very complicated lifestyle, it can be easily bred in captivity and then very successfully reintroduced.
Let's turn to wildlife trafficking and back to poaching. When it comes to those things, we have seen some progress with numbers going down in terms of poaching, prices for items like ivory and others, but what are some of the biggest challenges that still remain?
Well, we've certainly seen the price of ivory fall to less than 50% of what it was. The price of rhino horn has fallen, but there's still some tremendous problems with poaching. And one of the things, sadly, you find with this poaching is very often corruption is involved. Officials, both at the local end in Africa and then in Asia sometimes, will turn the other way for bribes. And so corruption is definitely a major problem for wildlife trafficking. And, that's why we've been focusing on trying to educate the public not to want to buy these products, because there are still institutional problems, lack of funding for enforcement. These are all ongoing challenges. And really, if we can persuade people not to buy the products, is the best way to safeguard the animals for the future.